Welcome to the MedEvidence podcast. This episode is a rebroadcast from the Business of Vulnerability with Blake Kohler and Dr. Michael Koren on March 8th, 2023.
Welcome to the Business of Vulnerability podcast. Today on the podcast, we have Dr. Michael Koren. Dr. Koren is the founder and CEO of the Jacksonville Center for Clinical Research Group. And he's also the two-time president of the Academy of Physicians in Clinical Research. Dr. Koren, thank you for doing this, by the way.
And thank you for what you do, getting the word out about people that like to help other people. I appreciate that.
You know, it's actually kind of a selfish endeavor because I get to have these fun conversations.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, it's interesting. We talked briefly kind of before we started recording about why we do this podcast and what it is we do. But I'm really curious, you know, we'll get in a little more to what clinical trials are and things like that. But how did you end up here? Why clinical trials out of all the things you could be doing in the world that probably would be more lucrative being a doctor?
I guess I got lost on the way to the hospital and ended up in clinical research. But seriously, I grew up as a science and math person, and being a physician was the challenge for me. I'm the first physician in my family. And so I was fortunate enough to do well in college and get into medical school and then graduate. And then did a fellowship in cardiology after internal medicine residency. And throughout this process, research just fascinated me. And I always thought that it was neat to be practicing what was considered state of the art, but developing the state of the art was even more interesting. So, that's how I sort of got into it intellectually. And then in terms of the actual pragmatic elements of it, during medical school, I got my first exposure to clinical research, which was basically a decision analysis on how to make good medical decisions. And that led me to become an internist and ultimately a cardiologist rather than a surgeon. That was one of the factors, is this intellectual thought process of being able to set policy, to think through problems and then make recommendations that would impact lots of people. And then I did my training, and then following training, I was academically oriented. I applied for a number of faculty positions in different prestigious practices around the country, got accepted to a bunch, and happened to come to Florida because of an interesting hybrid position that allowed me to do some academic medicine. It allowed me to see patients and be a clinical cardiologist, but also to be exposed to clinical research in private practice. And I learned what that meant, and I learned that there were certain advantages of doing clinical research in private practice. And then getting to the point of your podcast, you can actually affect people's lives in a very positive way through clinical research. And that's become more and more of a driving force for me. So in modern medicine, you look very healthy, but I assume at some point you interacted with the modern healthcare system, which is very frustrating, quite frankly. And it's very bureaucratic. It's software driven. That's not always patient friendly. And the net effect is that patients don't feel cared for a lot in clinical practice. And in the research setting, it's very different because of our mandate to report everything, basically, and get that to the regulatory authorities, most importantly, the FDA. We spend a lot more time with our patients. We interact with them in ways that they wouldn't have access to. And we don't require insurance. So some of the access issues that other people have for the healthcare system are not relevant to us. And so that leads us to reach out to underserved populations and to teach people why they might want to get involved in clinical trials and what the benefits are to them.
Now, I've never considered the fact that when I hear of a clinical trial, I've always just assumed it's just, a doctor suggesting a little different form of treatment, and we're going to do a little study around it. But maybe not the other benefits that would come to me as a patient in that type of program.
Sure. And then just to be clear and transparent, we do get paid for what we do. So we do get study grants for the work that we do. And the majority of our study grants come from private industry, but we also get government grants, NIH being one of the sources. And we also apply for grants. It could be for not-for-profit organizations. It could be private equity firms now are sponsoring research to learn more about particular companies or issues. And the beauty of it is that the average person, without spending any of their own money, can glean the benefits of all this. In fact, a lot of patients get reimbursed for their time and effort. So you can actually put a little change in people's pocket by participating in the studies, which I get great pleasure out of. I find it that we can provide these benefits that are not necessarily well known to the average person in the public that can make a big difference. So, it could be the difference between having decent Christmas gifts or not by participating in a clinical trial. And that is one of the motivating factors. Of course, the legacy of what you do is another huge motivating factor. So, as a parent, we always want our kids to do as well or better than we did, and we want them to learn from our experience, as difficult as that may be at times. I don't know if you have kids, but that could be a challenge. But nonetheless, the legacy elements of what we do is extremely important. And in clinical research, all the information that we derive from study participation is shared throughout the planet. So we have platforms and protocols and ways of sharing this information so that we all learn from each other. So it's just, I feel blessed every day, and it's just a tremendous opportunity to both do well for our community and to give back.
I'm curious, going all the way back to how you got started in this. When did this germ of an idea of doing research pop up? Right, how early in your I guess trajectory to become a medical practitioner did you decide that I think I'd like to do this type of work?
Well, I like puzzles, so. Clinical research is kind of like a puzzle. So what we do in clinical research is we ask a question, and then we have a structured experiment to come up with the answer. And it's an example of using logic on a very large scale to answer some very difficult questions. And I just intrinsically love that challenge, and it's been a big source of attraction for me.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, people will talk about clinical trials all the time, and I'm curious from a layman's perspective, what can you explain just kind of how a clinical trial works and the benefits of it? And
Sure.
I think most people know we get new treatments or medicines or things from it, but don't really understand what that means.
Sure.
So could you give us kind of a layman's overview of?
Yeah. So it all starts from a question, a simple question. So the question may be, is one diuretic better than another diuretic for high blood pressure? And unless you do a structured observation, you won't know the answer to that. You can get doctors' opinions, and that may be somewhat valuable. But the truth is, without the structured experiment, you're just guessing on the answer. And in the structured experiment, you're keeping everything the same except the one variable that reflects on that question. So I use the example of two different diuretics. And that study was done recently. It was a government-sponsored study, and it showed that two commonly used diuretics were more or less the same. So that was a good answer, and we can now tell patients that. We do a lot of work with pharmaceutical companies that are trying to get products approved. So for them, they have a new molecule, and they have to show the Food and Drug Administration and other regulatory authorities that their molecule brings some value to patients and doesn't do harm. So we do studies that will look at all patients that have a particular diagnosis, and the only thing will change is that medication, whether or not they get that versus a placebo, or whether or not they get that medication versus a standard therapy. And everything else is the same. They get all the care they would, regardless of which group they're in, and then we track their outcomes. And of course, we look out for people. So during the course of their participation, if they're having chest pain, we check it out. If they're finding some sort of side effect of the product, we evaluate that thoroughly. And we don't have any vested interest in the product. So I don't own stock in the product. I'm just an independent tester that's responsible for putting together the team that actually collects the information. So again, to answer your question, it starts with a question. Then we create a protocol that answers that question by just changing that one variable and keeping everything else the same across different patient populations.
So going back to my high school science classes, it very much sounds like the experiments that we'd run in class where it's, what's your control group and what's your hypothesis?
Exactly.
But it sounds like the hypothesis are brought to you and you're the ones that then prove it out, as opposed to somebody else saying, here's my hypothesis and I'm going to do the research ourselves.
Well, it goes both ways. So we have done what's called investigator-initiated research, where we develop the hypothesis, and then we can either self-fund it if it's not too expensive, or look for funding for it. And that could be government grants, could be industry grants that are put aside for these things, or other sources. So anybody could develop the hypothesis and ask the question. But more typically, it's a commercial entity that's creating the hypothesis that we have to prove one way or another. But you're right. You'll see those high school science classes actually came in handy.
They do.
You can understand exactly what I'm talking about.
Turns out it's just a kind of writ large in a lot of regards there.
Yeah.
I'm curious, right? So going back to that high school science class, like everything that I remember doing experiments on are kind of static things that don't really change unless there's some sort of thing there. But humans are different. I mean, there's all sorts of variables that go into our lives, and
no, you're exactly right, and that's why we call it clinical research. So what the word clinical research means is it involves human beings. And so you're absolutely right. When you do experiments on plants, you don't have to worry if they're going to show up for their visits. So there are some challenges to running clinical trials and doing clinical research, but that's a neat challenge, and that's the human element of it. So that is a difference between what you do in high school, science typically, and what we do. Although I have, through the science fairs of my kids, I've seen that even kids in high school now, and even kids in junior high school, are starting to do little experiments with people, getting your friends together and seeing if you have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or not, whether or not you can solve math problems better. That would be a simple hypothesis. And I'm proud actually of the organizations, the schools. They're making people get informed consent for these things, which is a very important principle of clinical research, is that people don't get researched without their permission. And then also they state certain things about the research so people know that they are part of this structured observation and that certain ethical principles are adhered to.
That actually brings up a good point. For those that are participating in the research, like I think people may not understand how that process works and may even have thought that they were part of some sort of research and not known about it. But there's very particular steps and rules and kind of a process. Can you help us understand how that would work? If I was going to participate in one of your trials, what would that actually look like?
Well, if any human that participates in a clinical trial has to go through an informed consent process, unless it's just statistical research. So the truth is nowadays that there will be research done on individuals based on the boatload of information that's out there about all of us on the web. But as long as we're not individually identified, then that's just part of living in the modern world. We don't have much control of that. But when we get into patient level research, which is what we do here, then you need to get the consent of somebody. And that's a whole process. That's not a simple thing. These are forms that may be up to 30 pages, and we make sure that every patient has the opportunity to sit down with a staff member or even me if they request it, and know that all their questions are answered and make sure that they understand what they're getting involved with. It's a very, very important principle. And it wasn't always like that. So in the early 20th century, for example, that wasn't done. And there were some infamous examples of that where people were researched without their knowledge. That will not fly in the current environment. And we go through great pains to make sure that people are adequately informed. In fact, you may argue that we may overdo it at this point. We not only make them sign a 30-page form when they start the program, but every time there's a trivial change in the research, we make them sign another 30-page form. So literally there may be some small bureaucratic touch-ups to a protocol that would not necessarily reflect anything on the patient's experience, but we make them sign a form nonetheless to know that there has been a change from what they originally signed up for.
So if I decided that I wanted to participate in a clinical trial, like how, I assume I can't just like decide right now I want to go participate in a clinical trial and go sign up for something. Do I have to be recommended?
Sure. Come on down. We'll sign you up for something.
Test me, put me in something.
Yeah, well, so joking aside, most of the stuff that we do is for people that have a specific problem. But we do work for people that are just healthy people. So for example, we were very, very involved in the COVID-19 vaccine development programs for Pfizer, Moderna, and Novavax. And most of those people were basically healthy people. They might have had some conditions. Early on, we were focused mostly on the most vulnerable patients, which were older patients and patients that had pre-existing conditions or patients that had exposure risk. So for example, in the early days of COVID-19 research, there were a lot of healthcare workers that were part of the studies. Not that they were unhealthy, but they were exposed to the pathogen and at higher risk on that basis. So again, we'd have to get to know you a little bit, and we'd have to learn what your medical history is, and then we could direct you. And sometimes they're simple things. So for example, we did a study many, many years ago where people went to a baseball game and ate a bunch of chili. And these were basically people who are healthy, but if people that may have had some indigestion at some point in their lives, which I think is probably most of us, and we give them a pill or a placebo, and we would see whether or not the chili caused indigestion. So, you or another healthy person could be a candidate for that type of research. So there's lots of things out there.
Hey, going to a baseball game and getting chili sounds like a pretty good gig, actually.
Yeah, it's not bad. Yeah,
especially if it's in Florida. I mean,
yeah.
a little different here in Utah right now. That would be a little rough, but Florida sounds great.
And there could be, if you're a skier in Utah, there could be studies that look at different types of boots while you're skiing, and you get randomized to one or another and see whether that reduces injuries from skiing, and a multiplicity of other things that we do.
So we've talked a little bit about how you got into it and what clinical trials are, and a little bit about participants. I'm curious, kind of still on that participant. I think there's a perception, and maybe it's just me, but that clinical trials are risky, that I wouldn't want to sign up because there's a risk. Right. And I'm sure there's some inherent risk because it's a little bit of an unknown, but what can you share with us about what you do to try and limit that risk? Or
Sure.
I guess maybe how worried should I be if I was going to go eat chili at the baseball game?
Sure. Well, there would definitely be risks of eating chili at a baseball game. There's risks of crossing the street. So if you were to cross the street for a clinical trial, I would fully disclose everything. I would say something like, well, you're going to cross the street, and you kind of have to cross the street because you live across the street. But, it's possible that when you cross the street, you can be hit by a car. It's possible that there's a puddle in the street and a car will splash you with that puddle and ruin all your clothes. It's possible that a driver will yell obscenities at you while you cross the street and ruin your day. So all these things are possible risks of crossing the street. Now, of course, experience tells me that chances are we'll get you through that okay. But you make a good point, which is that the unknown is sometimes very, very difficult for people to understand. So people can have a sense through their experience what the risk is of crossing the street, but the risk of a new drug is a little bit trickier. And that's why we have multiple physicians and other staff members who look out for people. We have phone numbers that people can call if they're concerned about anything during the course of the study. And we have protocols that are particularly set up to minimize what we consider to be anticipated risks. So there's a lot of safety features in it. And the interesting thing is that people who do clinical trials that have a particular disease tend to do better than people who are not in clinical trials. And there's probably a lot of reasons for that, but one is the extra scrutiny of your care that goes into a clinical trial, and two is more human interaction and the fact that if you're a person that gets into clinical trial, you're learning more about your disease state, and you'll probably do more of the right thing. So, for example, cancer patients who may not have a great prognosis tend to do better in any clinical trial, whether or not they get the interventional product. So there is a lot to be said about just being observed. In fact, there's a term for it called the Hawthorne effect, where people who are observed tend to just do better. And so there's something else called the placebo effect and other things. So yes, there's risks in everything we do in life, and we minimize these risks in the clinical trial process. And maybe counterintuitively, your risk of day-to-day life may actually be less participating in a clinical trial than in other things that you might do day to day.
It brought up another question that is really tangential and purely by curiosity, but I'm curious, with all of your data, there has to be some noise that pops in just because of day-to-day life. So for instance, I was thinking about, you're doing the trials with the vaccines, and if I'm participating in the trial and then I have a heart attack, how do you distinguish it from people have heart attacks every day?
Right.
This may have come from the
Sure.
the trial that we're doing.
Absolutely. Well, that's why we have a control group, so that you're getting right into the core of how clinical research is set up, is that the control group has everything that's exactly the same with the interventional group, except that one intervention. So by looking at what happens in the control group and comparing that with the interventional group, we can make judgments about what causes what.
Interesting. Are there times where you have to have a very tight control group? I'm just thinking, like, is there certain things where you try and get like siblings or twins or anything like that where you want as close of a control, because humans are innately different?
Sure. Yeah, so you're getting into something that we call power calculation. So there is noise in any kind of observation, and the larger the population you study, the less the noise is compared to the signal that you're looking for. So if you have a huge signal, then you need few numbers of patients and the noise is less relevant. But if the signal is smaller, then the noise can be more important. So we actually have statistical ways of figuring that out. And to your point, we do try to create some uniformity in the overall study population. But again, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, that could be more or less. But we don't necessarily look for siblings or people in the same family necessarily.
Makes sense. But I don't have you for very much more time, and I've got a few more questions, so I'm going to try and parse which ones are the best to ask here. But I'm curious. I guess we'll start with this. If I want to participate in a clinical trial, somebody listening to this says, like, this seems like a way I could help. I'm healthy. Like, this seems good. How would I go about doing it? Like, I'm sure I could search on the internet clinical trials, but
well, there are many ways you can look at that. So there are centers all over the United States, and in Utah there are plenty of centers that run clinical research. There are certain practices in healthcare that run clinical research. It may not be their biggest priority, but they may be focused on a particular diagnosis. So to answer your question, if you have a diagnosis or some particular medical concern, you can put that medical concern in a Google bar and look for clinical trials and get that. You can go to the government website. There's a government website that specifically tells you clinicaltrials.gov, and that'll give you all the information you want about all the clinical trials that are registered with the U.S. government and the FDA. So that's out there. And then just local trials are ubiquitous in the United States. So we are here in Northeast Florida. We have sites throughout Florida. But if you're in Utah, there are companies that do work out there. So you'll find, wherever you are in the United States, you'll find a place that runs clinical research, because it's not a small industry. The research industry is not nearly as big as the overall healthcare industry, of course, but it's not trivial either. So it's it's about $25 billion a year that's spent in running clinical trials in the U.S.
It reminded me as we were preparing for this podcast, you mentioned, or your team mentioned, you run a podcast of your own that I believe talks about medical evidence and kind of this research process. And there's got to be some of our listeners that are fascinated by this. How would they hear more of what you do, and how would they hear your podcast? What's the name? The best way
thanks for that question. Our platform is called MedEvidence. And you can look it up on medevidence.info. And so this is something that we developed, maybe a decade ago. And we do a lot of teaching here at our center. And it started out just putting all of our assets into the MedEvidence platform, whether it was a PowerPoint presentation at a national meeting or our internal investigator training initiatives or other things where we're teaching people about what we do here in clinical research. But it occurred to me that people were really hungry for the truth. And when I ask people, well, how do you get medical information? What's your trusted source? Most of them say, well, just put in the Google bar. And when you do that, you're going to get some stuff that is mostly proprietarily driven. So people are going to try to sell you a product more or less based on what your request is. So if you put something out about sunburn, you want to learn about that, of course, you're going to get sunscreen companies and other people that are going to treat sunburn. And they're going to have all their concoctions, some of which are proven, some of which are not proven, some of which may make things worse. But you have no way of really understanding the truth. From our perspective, we're not selling any product other than research itself. That's the product that we sell. And so it's basically a truth-finding mechanism. And it got me thinking, isn't it neat that we can share that insight with people? Again, we don't have any vested interest in the results of the trial, but if they're positive, we want to let people know. If they're negative, we want to let people know. And we want to let people know more broadly the strength of that evidence. So one of the things you'll hear is, oh, somebody says aspirin is good, somebody says aspirin is bad. Is it good or bad? COVID-19 vaccines, literally, I went to a wedding this weekend, and I said I developed COVID-19 vaccines, and half of the people thought I was a hero, half of the people thought I was a villain at the wedding. And obviously there's good and bad in everything, and COVID-19 vaccines are certainly life-saving in the right population and perhaps unnecessary in other populations. But everything is so polarized nowadays that it's hard to find the middle ground and the real truth. And the truth intersects with the data and also who you are as an individual. And we try to help people navigate that.
Wow. That in and of itself is a fantastic mission, because because it can be confusing and a lot of times for people. I've got one last question. I guess a little lighthearted, but when you visit a medical doctor, practitioner, your physician, whatever, and they prescribe something, how much do you go and look at the clinical trials that were ran on the things that are prescribed to you?
I would only take the medicine after I looked at all the clinical trials. Now, of course, fortunately, I've had limited medical issues, thank God. But I have interacted with the healthcare space, and even for a knowledgeable physician like me, it's sometimes hard to get at it. There's so much information out there, and that's why MedEvidence may be a good way for people to explore. And we've done a number of podcasts on NASH, which is fatty liver disease. It's called non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, or fatty liver disease that's unrelated to alcohol or viral hepatitis. We've done all kinds of podcasts on lipid problems, blood fats, cholesterol, lipoprotein(a), triglycerides, etc. So, there's multiple topics that we've addressed and looked at it by having physicians talking about it and looking deeply into the issue, deep dive into the issue that we try to make entertaining, because people don't want to be bored with a bunch of boring nonsense. Just like you and I having this conversation, they want their information to be conversational, but literally getting into the data in a way that is useful for people.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Koren, thanks so much for joining this podcast. Thank you for the work that you're doing, for the work in research and clinical trials. I know it's something you love, but I guarantee there's much out there that wouldn't.
Yeah, and I'll leave you with one last thought, and it's one of my favorite things to help people understand. There have been surveys done of people throughout the world, in both the US and Europe mostly, and they asked the average person on the street, would you be interested in doing a clinical trial? And when you ask people, just random people, only about 50% said they would be interested in doing it. But when you survey people who have been exposed to clinical trials, they've had one exposure to clinical trials, and ask them would they do a second clinical trial, 97% say yes. And in our organization, it's 99% say yes. So it's one of those, and I'm glad you're doing what you're doing, because it's one of those things that most people don't know much about, that they're maybe a little suspicious about, but once they're introduced to it, they happen to love it.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Koren, thank you for joining today. And I hope people take time to check out your podcast and learn more about the clinical trials and evidence that's coming out.
Great talking with you.
Thanks for joining the MedEvidence podcast. To learn more, head over to medevidence.info or subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform.